Okay, ready?
Yep. I
Oh, you did it. Okay, good.
All right. Hello, everybody. Okay. All right. All right. I'm gonna actually start, and Sabina, if you can keep an eye on the waiting room. Um, so, all right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Books and Beyond for 2025. And thank you for being with us today. So my name is Pinky Shah, and I'll be your host for tonight, along with Sabina. We'll have an interaction question answer session towards the end. At that time, feel free to raise your hand and ask a question directly, or you can type it in the chat, and we can gladly ask it for you. Tonight, we are joined by Mikki Brammer to discuss her debut novel, The Collected Regrets of Clover. She's an Australian journalist based in New York City. She writes about design, architecture, and art for publications such as Architectural Digest, Dwell, and Elle Decor. Welcome, Mikki, and thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. I've got a bit of a cold, but hopefully that it doesn't affect it too much.
And I hope it doesn't bother you when you have to talk much. Would you be comfortable reading a paragraph to start our program with? Would you be able to comfortable reading a paragraph from your book?
Yeah, sure. I'll read a little bit from the beginning since that's a good place to start.
Yes, thank you.
Um, I'll just read at the first page, which is because I write very short paragraphs, so otherwise you'll just get 3 sentences. The first time I watched someone die, I was 5. Mr. Hyland, my kindergarten teacher, was a cheerful, tubby man whose shiny scalp and perfectly round face reminded me of the moon. One afternoon, my classmates and I sat cross-legged on the scratchy carpet in front of him, enthralled by his theatrical telling of Peter Rabbit. I remember how his meaty thighs spilled over the edges of the child-sized wooden chair he sat on. His cheeks were rosier than usual, but who could blame him for getting excited over a good Beatrix Potter plot? As the story reached its climax, when Peter Rabbit lost his jacket fleeing the evil Mr. McGregor, Mr. Hyland stopped, as if pausing for emphasis. We stared up at him, hearts thumping with anticipation. But instead of resuming his narration, he made a sound similar to a hiccup, eyes bulging. Then, like a felled redwood tree, he toppled to the ground. We all sat motionless, wide-eyed, unsure if our beloved teacher was just upping the ante on his usual dramatic storytelling. But when he hadn't moved after several minutes, not even to blink his open eyes, the room erupted with squeals of panic from everyone. Everyone except for me, that is.
Thank you, Mikki. I have to confess, when actually I came across your book, I purely judged your book by the cover. I loved it, first of all. And when I read the title of the book, Collected Regrets of Clover, in my head, I already had a story that what this book's gonna be about. So to my surprise, it's absolutely not what I thought, and it grabbed me right from the beginning. And I'm so glad it was not what I thought.
Oh, what did you think it was? Now I'm curious.
In my head, it was like Clover is a character, and then she has so many regrets in her life. So it's a little bit of that, but what I thought is this her own regrets, but the book is very different than what I thought. So and I absolutely loved your book. And then I mentioned it to Sabina, and she loved the book too. And here we are. So before we actually jump deep into the discussion, I was just when I was reading your bio, I'm so intrigued to learn how you transitioned from writing about design and architecture from writing a book on death doula work. Could you please share your journey with us, how the idea of your first novel came to be?
Oh yeah. So I had never really planned to write fiction. You know, people always ask me, oh, when you're going to write a book? And I'd always be like, I don't know, maybe one day with no intention of writing it. But then um, it kind of coincided with, so since I was a kid, I'd had a fear of death. And so I'd always avoided anything to do with death. So I wouldn't read anything about it, didn't like watching things or anything like that. And then when I kind of got into my 30s, I realized, well, maybe I should, instead of avoiding it, get curious about why this is. So, and as a person, I generally, when I'm scared of something, I make myself do it until I'm not scared of it. And so I was like, okay, well, then I'm going to immerse myself in it until I'm not scared of it anymore. And living in New York City, there's, you know, it's very easy to immerse yourself in something. So I started going to talks by hospice doctors, and I went to some lectures on stoicism because they're very preoccupied with mortality. You know, I listened to a lot of podcasts, and one day I was in the New York Public Library and I stumbled across a flyer for a death cafe, much like Clover does in the book. And at first I was like, oh my gosh, no way could I go to that. What is this? And then I thought, well, okay, no, this is I promised myself I was going to not avoid it. So I went, and that really opened my eyes to, you know, what it was like to talk about death openly. And so in this immersion, I came across the concept of a death doula, and I was just so intrigued because I thought, you know, who would dedicate their life or their professional life to essentially watching people die? And then what kind of person would choose that path? And then I thought, oh, that would be an interesting character. And then it happened to be like at the beginning of the pandemic, and I couldn't go back to Australia because they'd essentially closed the borders. And most people I know had left New York. So I was kind of here by myself. And I thought, well, you know, now's the time to write a book about death when there's siren kind of going past all day, when it's very, very present in everyone's life. So I just thought I would start writing it mainly just for me. And then I kind of thought, well, what if I could write a book for someone like me who would normally not read a book about death? So write a book that was fun and uplifting and optimistic while still kind of covering all these topics and all these things that I'd learned, but presenting it in a way that wasn't too maudlin or depressing or, you know, really hard to get through. And so that's how it came about. And then I just kept going until it was done, and then was lucky that an agent saw what I was trying to do, and it's the same with editors, and here it is.
Was this the name of the book, was the first draft, or you had other options as far as the title for the book go?
No, that was it. And I just kind of slapped it on because, you know, when you query an agent, you have to have a title for your book. So I was like, oh, I'll just do this and then it'll get changed down the path. And I kept waiting for it to get changed, and it didn't. Here it's there. It made it through.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. Uh, so do you like, because you just told us the journey, how you came up, the whole thing, how you ended up writing the book. So as far as the character development go, do you see yourself in any other characters or anybody that you knew in your life, you know, in your life that any character resembles any of the characters in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's me in all of the characters because, you know, there's probably a little bit, probably not what you would expect. You know, when people ask me, who are you most like in the book, I usually say Sebastian because he has the fear of death. And when he does that kind of speech about where his fear came from and how he felt about it, that was essentially what it was like for me. And everyone always like, oh, you're not Clover, but you know, anybody who knows me knows that I'm not like Clover, but I have, you know, I really love people. I love observing people and meeting people. And I think because I've lived in a lot of places, I'm always taking in details. So I think people it's an amalgamation of a lot of people. But I was raised by a single mother, and so a lot of my grandparents and great aunts and uncles and cousins all stepped in. So the elder characters are definitely a kind of have parts of those people in them. But I'm sure you all know the author Frederick Buckman, but I went to a talk by him once, and he said this wonderful thing about his characters that, you know, when you make orange juice, you use a lot of different oranges to make that juice. So it's the same with characters, that you take a little bit of a lot of different people and make it. So I wouldn't say, well, definitely no one is based solely on one person, but take a little bit from here and a little bit from there, and that's how it all came together.
Did you, any parts of your writing journey or character development, did you find any particular process difficult? And also, to stretch this question a little bit more, do you have a favorite character?
I do have a favorite character. I think maybe Leo. He was fun to write. I think the problem with Sebastian was he was much worse in the draft. And then the editors said I had to make him nice. So everyone's like, oh, he's the worst. I'm like, well, you should have seen him before, because he was. So I did struggle a little bit with finding a balance of, not that he's necessarily the villain, but, you know, he probably is the least likable character in that. But I really wanted to make everybody have their flaws and maybe things that people wouldn't like about them, because that's what it is to be human. And nobody likes everything about everybody. So I think, yeah, I do really enjoy writing the older characters, because they remind me of the people who were in my life and really helped guide me. And so it was nice to kind of write a tribute to them in a way.
Wonderful. And again, death doula. So when you came across the concept of death doula, you knew a little bit about it, and did you have to do a lot more research, because your main character's work is that, so you want to be, you know, more precise about it? What kind of research went into Clover's character?
Yeah, I did a lot of research. I did talk to some death doulas. Some of them were, rightly so, quite reticent on sharing particular experiences, because, you know, it is a very private, personal act that they're involved in. So, but I did speak to a few, and they helped answer my questions. And I read a lot of books and listened to a lot of podcasts, and also spoke to like hospice doctors, and a lot of people in my family are doctors and nurses, and I have a few friends who are doctors. So I spoke to them about what it's like to be someone around someone at that end of life stage. And then what I really realized in my research is that there's very many interpretations of being a death doula. You know, some people do have a medical or health background. Some people kind of do more of that home health aid work. For some people, it's more logistics, you know, helping things get organized, you know, with the documentation and planning things. And others are more existential, which Clover kind of is, you know, helping people work through those bigger questions in life. And so I was like, oh, well, how do I represent this? And then I decided I would just write it as if I were a death doula, how would I approach it? And that's kind of what Clover does, with all that information in mind.
Yeah. Okay. It's fascinating concept, and the way you said that a lot of people, especially in the city, they are by themselves on their last days, and somebody like this exists. I think it's it is fascinating.
Yeah, and it's a very noble thing to do, especially because a lot of death doulas are volunteers, actually, or they work on a sliding scale. And when you think about the fact that people are, you know, it's emotionally taxing, you know, takes up a lot of time, and that a lot of those people don't get paid for it, it makes it even more noble. But a lot of people similar to Clover go into the profession because they've experienced it themselves and have helped a loved one transition and kind of see it as a calling. And I think you would need to see it as a calling in order to do it on such a regular basis.
Yep, yep. And the other day we were just talking about it at the library, that we are so grateful that there are so many professions that are very tough to do, and it takes a special person to do certain kind of work. Death doula is one of them. We were talking about pediatrics. Just working in
Yes.
pediatrics and seeing kids suffer day in and day out it's not an easy thing to do, and to keep yourself calm and composed so you can help them. It's not easy thing to do, and people are just special. People are made special. They can handle certain profession, and death doula is certainly one of them. That it's not everybody. It's not an easy thing to do, but like you put it very beautifully, it's a noble thing to do. And we are thankful and grateful for
Yes.
people who exist and do this noble thing. And again, I never ever heard of word death cafe. If somebody had would just thrown that word and in front of me, I would have probably laughed that, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
But then after I read in your book, and then I was researching also, first thing that came up was New York Public Library, and it's a
Oh, really? Okay.
it's a regular thing. It's a scheduled thing that happens at New York Public Library.
Yes.
And if anywhere, New York is the place. If you can think of something, I am pretty sure it exists.
Yes, yeah. The interesting thing about death cafes, and a lot of people think I made that up, but and that it's definitely, but I did go to that New York Public Library one a few times, but they actually exist all over the world, you know, even in small towns, which when people are like, oh, they wouldn't have one in my town, I'm like, they might. You should check, because there's a website that kind of lists them all, and there's online ones, and I think they're becoming more and more common, which I think is wonderful.
What was your experience? Did that help you, or that was like, I tried and not for me kind of thing when you went to that cafe?
Oh no, it was really helpful, because as I said, you know, I hadn't really talked about death because I'd avoided it. And so to see all these people, and everybody was there, like in the book, for really different reasons, you know. Some were just curious, some there were a few people who had lost people, but it wasn't just people who were grieving. It was all walks of life. And as you can imagine, in New York, lots of different characters. But you kind of, similar to an AA meeting, you know, you go around and introduce yourself and say why you're there. And that was the first time I said, you know, I'm Mikki and I'm here because I have a fear of death. And I thought this might help. And, you know, just going and the way they work is the moderator will just start a discussion about a topic to do with that, you know, I think like, well, in the book, I think it's like sea burial versus composting or something, but something a lot, and then everybody discusses it. And it just really took the kind of scariness out of it to see everybody chat about it in different ways and hear different perspectives. And I think it was very beneficial.
It opens up your mind, I guess. Anytime you talk to other people and let yourself hear other perspective, it always helps.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. One of the thing about what I got across the question was, what prompted you to have Clover and Hugo read the letters that Hugo's grandfather sent to Claudia? It's a little bit out of Clover's character.
Oh, you mean instead of just respecting their privacy?
Yes.
Yeah, I actually there's a few things Clover does that are questionable. And I did that on purpose because, you know, she is a flawed character. Like the fact that she even went to find the other Hugo is questionable without Claudia's permission. But I think that was part of her as a character. It is out of character, but in a way it is her character because she's not perfect and she makes quite a few, and over the years has made quite a few questionable life decisions. So I think I think that was to illustrate, you know, her only reference of relationships, love relationships, are movies and books, which are not accurate representations. And so in a way, she got swept away by that and let that influence her, which is not a great thing. And yes, it worked out for her, but it could have not worked out for her. So I think I really wanted to create that tension of like, she doesn't always know the right thing to say, and she doesn't always make the right choice, even though she's very good at her job.
Yeah. One of the sentences that kind of stuck to me, and I would read that. It's quote, grief is just love looking for a place to settle. Can you elaborate on this, what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think I say earlier in the book how in Western society medically they classify grief as chronic if you're still heavily grieving after 6 months, which just really, I couldn't believe that, because you're going to grieve someone forever, and it may not be as intense, but it's going to happen. And I think if you loved someone, then you're going to grieve them, and that love is kind of proportional to that grief. And so I wanted to find a way to represent that, and using the dust metaphor, which comes just before that, thinking that sometimes, like with dust, you think you've got it all and you've wiped it all away, and you're like, okay, I've gotten over this grief, and then something happens, and like you find a little bit of dust somewhere, and it makes you sneeze or something similar to that. You'll find an object and it will remind you of that person, and all of a sudden that grief comes back. So it's just, when the dust settles, when the love settles, it's all okay. But then when it's kicked up, that's when the feelings come back, but they never actually go away.
Right. And it's actually very unfortunate that in our society, people have kind of a fixed mindset that how one's supposed to grieve, or how long one, like you said, if you grieve somebody longer than 6 months, then you know what, you should go see a doctor or psychiatrist.
Yeah, or you should go on medication. Yeah.
Medication, because or if you don't cry, either you didn't care much about your love. So like there is a like these are the bullet points. If you don't behave the way society has pictured how you're supposed to grieve somebody, then something's wrong with you, which is unfortunate. It's very unfortunate, because love and grief, everybody has their own way, and sometimes you surprise yourself how you react to the situation when you come into that situation first time. Because even though you're part of the society, you also feel like, oh, I'm supposed to cry, but why am I not crying? Did I not love that? Like, even before society questions, you question yourself. Something's wrong with you. Why am I not crying? If so it's about time.
Yes. And on top of that, I think one of the reasons we as a society are in such a hurry for people to get over their grief is because seeing people grieving makes us uncomfortable, and because we don't know what to do with it or how to react, then we're like, well, they just need to get over it. Are you still sad? And I think that's one of the things I learned the most myself in researching and writing this book, because I think when I was either with someone who was grieving or had a terminal illness, I'm a very optimistic person, so I would always be trying to cheer them up and think positive and be really happy, and that's not always what people need. And I think the best way to be with someone who is grieving or ill is to ask them what they need. Do you want a cheerleader? Do you want someone to listen? Or do you just want to be hugged? Or do you want to talk about how much this sucks? And that might be different depending on the day, but it's up to them. And I think the best thing you can do for someone in that situation is to bear witness and to be there no matter what, and let them know that they're not alone in it. And that doesn't mean you have to be talking all the time. You can just be sitting with them. You could be like doing a puzzle with them or something, but it's just about reminding them that they're not doing it alone.
You're there for them. I agree, because another thing that we always talk about, that as a human being in certain roles, you always want to fix things. So when you see somebody sad or in a difficult situation, your brain kicks in and like, what can I do to fix this situation. And
Mhm.
especially in a situation like death, there is nothing you could do
Mhm.
to
No.
fix that, unfortunately, so in that is, like you said, it's either you just be there for them and listen and let them be, however they want to grieve, just let them be and tell them that you're there for
Mhm.
them. But it's a learning process for all of us, and we don't know until you go through your own experience how to
Right.
deal with it.
Mhm.
And one thing that it's in life is inevitable that we don't talk about it. That's another unfortunate.
Yes. Well, that's another reason that I kind of wanted to write the book, because I understand why people don't talk about it, because I was the same, but the fact that it's one of the few things in life that are guaranteed, and we just don't talk about it until it happens. And in doing so, that makes it harder for the people left behind, because, there's things left unsaid. They don't know what final wishes are and stuff like that. So I'm hoped that by writing it, it would make people think about, oh, what could I maybe have these conversations with my family and loved ones now? And ironically, my family is very open about death because they're all doctors and nurses. And I think I was like the little creative, imaginative one. And I don't think anybody, because they were all fine with it, they didn't realize that I was not fine with it. And so it wasn't that they didn't talk about it, it was that I didn't express that it was bothering me. Because when I was writing the book and I talked to my mom about it, she's like, oh, I didn't realize that you had a fear of death, because I don't, she doesn't have a problem with it because she's seen a lot of it. And my brother, he's a doctor as well, so she's a nurse and he's a doctor, and so they've seen a lot. So I think it just didn't occur to them.
Yeah, because when you're comfortable with something, it's hard for you to imagine, and especially
Right.
that I'm sure she's fine too, because
Yeah.
that's the reality of life.
Yeah, exactly.
So, regrets, sometimes it can weigh very heavily on someone, while somebody can take it as a motivation and try to change.
Mhm.
And for Clover, initially it was very hard for her. Her, like you said, she was not perfect. Her life was not perfect since her childhood. Nothing was perfect. But somehow she started keeping all these binders of regrets and wishes and all that stuff, and she tried to incorporate those wishes and regrets and everything in her life. Why do you think it was easy for her to kind of learn or also respect other people's wishes and regrets, but not learn from um, her own life?
Yeah, I think it's kind of that thing that it's always easier to solve other people's problems. So and you can always see perspective when it's not you. But I think it was her way of it having an excuse to not tend to her own regrets, because she's like, oh, well, I've saved myself all these other regrets by, kind of preemptively doing them. But that was a distraction from actually going inside and going, actually, what do I regret? Which I think a lot of us do. You don't, that's the thing, you don't stop to think about those things until it's too late or till it's close to the end. And that's what really struck me when I was researching what people say on their deathbed and the regrets they have. And they were never grand things like, I wish I'd become a movie star, or I wish I'd played in the Super Bowl. It's like, I wish I'd worked less, or, learned piano, or said I love you more, or
Had
hugged
mango a
people
little
more.
earlier in my life.
Oh, that was a real regret I had, actually. Yeah. I didn't. I
Because
was
that's what I read, and I was like, oh my God, like you said, not everything doesn't have to be big
Yeah.
regrets. I wish I had started eating mango earlier in my life, and that was
Exactly. I didn't eat mangoes till I was 30. And I was living in Australia then, and I'd always avoided them. And I'm from Tasmania, but where I went to college is Queensland, which is a tropical state. So it has the best mangoes. But I was always like, mango is gross. And then like a couple of weeks before I was due to leave the country, one of my colleagues was eating a mango and she's like, "Do you want some?" And I was like, "Oh, why not try it?" And I tried and I was like, "Wait, what? I've been missing out on this." And then I kind of had this montage of 30 years worth of mangoes that I'd missed out on eating. So now I eat a lot. And the sad thing is, no offense, but American mangoes are not great.
I come from India and I've had better.
Yes.
So when you were researching, any other regrets that you might not have incorporated in your book that you came across that kind of stuck with you?
Of other people's regrets?
Yeah.
Really just like, it was just, I think what struck me was really the small things. Oh, what was interesting, it isn't necessarily a regret, but it surprised me how many people ask for divorces on their deathbeds. And that's
Oh, I wish
because,
I would have gotten divorced earlier, kind of thing.
yeah, but some of them actually request a divorce. Well, quite a few people, because for whatever reason, they don't want to leave this world still married to this person. So I guess in a way that is a regret because they've regretted not doing it sooner. And I actually know someone personally or who did that and was just like, no, I don't want it. She kind of had a terminal illness and was so knew kind of what was happening, and she like split up with her husband and then went to a different place to kind of and to live out her last few months. So yeah, I think that was the most surprising. I mean, it's all just very sad because all the regrets are generally things that would have been pretty easy to do. Like, I'm sure, learning piano or learning a language, maybe you wouldn't have mastered it, but you could have, I think the enjoyment you would have got from that would have been in the process of learning, not in the mastery.
Right.
But other things like saying I love you more or working less or, taking a painting class or something, like those are very, very simple things. And I really hope by presenting that in the book, a reader might stop and think, okay, instead of thinking about this, at the end, maybe I could think about it now. Like, what would I regret if, I was on my deathbed and maybe I could take a step towards it. And I think a lot of people think that I am saying regrets are a bad thing, but like you said, they don't have to be. It's
Right.
more if you don't acknowledge them, because when we do something that we regret, that's how we learn and grow. And if you didn't have regrets, then you're probably living quite a boring life. But that's how like, once I got bangs and I regretted that, and now I know that bangs
Not
don't
to,
suit me. Exactly.
not
So
to
that
get
was
or
a very useful regret. And there's a lot of things like that, when I add a certain ingredient to a soup and it tastes horrible, I regret it then, but now I know that doesn't work in soup. So I think the key isn't not having regrets. The key is acknowledging them and then learning from them.
And in your perspective, sometimes when you see your loved one leave the world, in that moment you have that instant perspective in life that, okay, I'm not gonna sweat the small stuff, and you try to live with that for maybe couple days, a week, a month, but then routine life hits you and then you kind of go back with, oh, why is she talking to me like that? Or
Yeah.
why in your perspective, why do you think that we cannot, again, knowingly, that death is inevitable and we have read this, we have the knowledge, but why do you think we have a hard time applying some of them? So there are some people who can probably live the life that I'm not one of them. I try my best, but not there yet. But like, knowing we have a knowledge, but knowledge is kind of useless if you don't apply it.
Yeah, I think it's because we're human and human beings are imperfect, and that's what makes people interesting. And I think, part of being human is like yes, there is a finish line, i.e. death, but it's not like you're perfect at that finish line. Life is you're constantly working on yourself, whether you live 50 years or if someone lived 150 years, you'd always be finding things to improve. And I think growing is hard, learning is hard. And so something like we can see, I think we all know, you know, we could eat healthier, we could exercise more, but we don't. Like, I think that's true of a lot of things, but, you know, I think that's kind of the paradox of being human, but it's also like humans would be pretty boring if we all did everything perfectly and did everything we should have. There'd be no stories. There'd be
True.
it would just be a very boring life. So it's true that we don't, but you know, maybe that is just because that's who we are.
That's what I guess makes a life worth
A
living.
life, exactly. Yes.
Um, do you have any future project that you're working on?
Yeah, I'm working on a second book, which has much less death. It has the normal amount of death, so you know, it's not like people dying every couple of chapters. And it is, I would say, a similar tone, like existential, but a very different story. And
So
that's
it's not nothing to do with this. It's just a whole kind of a new book.
yeah, whole different, yeah, not a
Okay.
sequel or anything.
Okay. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. And do you have like the publication date? If you,
Not yet. It's with my editors right now, so it depends on what they think of it.
so
as to when-
you finished your part.
Yeah, it's a
Okay.
first draft, so still
Okay.
early days. But yeah, but we'll see. Hopefully, in the next year or two, it'll come out because you know books have very long lead time.
Did you start writing this one after you published your first?
Yeah, I had kind of had the seed for the idea and then thought about it for a while and then sat down, and when it was ready to come, it came. So and it felt like a good kind of story in conversation with Clover, but very different. So yeah, it's not the same world, but similar themes, life affirming, I guess, and presenting those kind of existential questions that Clover does.
Okay. Does the second book come a little easier than the first one, or is it's
I wrote
different
both of
book
them.
journey?
Yeah. I think with Clover, because I had nothing else to do, I think that came quickly. I think it was, I think, as you mentioned, like, you know, I'm a journalist. So the thing I struggle with Clover was, you know, as a journalist, you write maximum 1,000-word article and then you never think about it again. It gets published and, you know, it's there. But with the book, it's 90,000 words and you're with the same characters and it's this one long story. And when I first had the idea, all I thought was, okay, I have a death doula. She has 3 notebooks. And then what is she going to do for 90,000 words? So that was like, finding the characters and the themes, I knew what I wanted to convey, but finding that vehicle to kind of carry it and do it, and especially because I wanted to do it in a way that presented all these questions and themes about death, but in a fun, kind of uplifting way, that was the challenge. So it was kind of similar with this one, but I think it was easier because how I ended up approaching it with the first one was you probably noticed that I have very short chapters, which I like as a reader because it keeps you turning the page.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to write each chapter as, you know, they're about 1,500 words, 2,000 words. So kind of as an article, and breaking it up that way made it a lot easier. So I definitely did that with this second one. And I also outlined this second one, which I didn't do with the first, and having an outline is a lot easier.
Okay. All right. No, we're looking forward for it whenever it comes out. So good luck with that project.
Thank you.
Is that last question before I open it up to our patrons? Is there anything lately that you read that you would like to share with our patrons?
Yes, I really loved a few books recently. I really loved, no one ever understands it when I say it in my accent, but Shark Heart by Emily Haybeck. It's Shark Heart in American. Yeah. You probably say it in a similar way. I really loved that because that kind of, it does deal with the theme of grief, but it's a really beautiful, creative metaphor of what it means to kind of be with a loved one who has well, it is a metaphor, so this is my interpretation. Someone who has a terminal illness or perhaps, dementia or something like that. And it's just done in such a creative way and so beautifully written. I really loved Marta by Kaveh Akbar, which came out last year. And what else? So many good books, but I try to read as broadly as I can. I think, especially as someone who didn't study fiction and never planned to write it, I think it's a good way to learn and to admire what other people do, and not necessarily to then do that, but just I think it inspires me when people take risks or tackle difficult topics, and or just people whose style I really love. That is very, it's very inspiring.
No, thank you for sharing. Now, actually, I would like to open it up if anybody has a question. If you guys want to ask question, please unmute yourself, or if you want to type it in the chat, I can absolutely read it for you. Do we have any questions? Oh, wow, guys, I thought this is a subject people would have question. Oh, okay, Mrs. Thayer, you want to, okay, you want to unmute yourself, Mrs. Thayer? No, you're still, I don't know. No, you can't figure it out. No, you're still mute. Okay, if you want to type, then I can read it for you if you can't figure it out. Sabina, we can't do it, can we?
I was just trying to figure out how to do that.
I think we might be able to do it. Joanne Thayer, hold on. No, we can only ask her to unmute.
Mikki, I have a question for you. Well, actually, just a thought. I loved your book too. I thought it was beautifully uplifting. I think everybody that expects to read it thinks it's going to be really depressing, but it was so light and it's still deep, but it was very easy to read. I love the short chapters. The thing that really stood out to me was the little regret, or the little, the unburdening of the little story about the hamster. Was it a guinea pig? I forgot. That, I don't know why that sticks with me so much, but that was the little thing that you just want to let somebody know that you did. Those little things like you were saying.
Yes, yeah.
It was the little things. That story, I don't know why that's really stuck with me.
No, I'm glad you noticed that, because that resonated with me too. Like, that wasn't something particular, I made that up, but things along those lines, like the things that people do want to get off their chests at the end are often really small things, like when they were kids, or things that no one else remembers or would even care about, but they've carried this burden for so long.
You've carried it all your life. Yes.
And it probably has even shaped them as a person. He might have grown up thinking he's a bad person because he did this thing, and
nobody else
thought it was an accident. Yeah, exactly.
I don't know, that really stood, that stuck with me, and it makes me think of my own little things in life. So I
hopefully it inspired you to let them go if there's something that you had. But to your point, the main comment I get from people is, I wasn't going to read your book because it sounded too depressing, but then I read it and, it wasn't, which was the whole point. So that's really meaningful to me that it was a success in that way. But I mean, sometimes when I hear people describe my book, I even go, oh, that sounds really depressing, even though I know it's not. Yeah, it's a very hard.
You feel like, wow, this is so heavy, but it was, like I said, it was still super poignant and deep, but it did have a lightness about it. It was positive. And I did the audio, and I loved the audio.
Oh yes, Jennifer did such a wonderful job. It was an interesting thing about that is when they when we were choosing the narrators, they sent me 5 samples, and they just as auditions, and they each read the same passage. And when I first listened to it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so weird, because in my head, everybody has an Australian accent.
Yes.
And it was so strange to hear, even though all of the characters are American. So it was correct. It was so weird to hear. And, you know, people speak in a different cadence in American English than Australian English. So the emphasis and everything. And so it was a little bit jarring. And so I had to ask, I asked my editors and friends, well, which one do you think is best? And I really love it. Jennifer did such a great job.
It was awesome. Yes. I think Mrs. Thayer is unmuted.
Yep.
Yes.
Go ahead, Miss.
I don't know how I did it, but I enjoyed your book very much, and I have never heard of a death doula. And I thought it was fascinating, but it reminded me a lot of hospice. Would you compare it to hospice?
Yes, I would. And I did speak to quite a few people who worked in hospice to get their experiences, but I've had quite a few people who are hospice workers reach out to me and say they enjoyed it and that they felt that it captured the experience, which is such a relief to me, because, you know, not having actually gone through it, I can only kind of try to convey what I've heard from other people. But yes, I think it's pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. Well, you did a great job. And are you, being from Australia, are you familiar with the children's author Mem Fox?
Of course, yes.
And I loved her book, Wilfred Gordon MacDonald Partridge, where she talks about a young boy who can't understand why his elderly neighbor is, you know, suffering from dementia, and how every day he visits her at the nursing home and brings items to try to bring her memory back. But it's a beautiful story. I thought of your book when I thought of that book when I was reading your book.
Oh, she's one of our most treasured authors in Australia. I grew up with her stories, and kids now are still growing up with her stories.
Yes, in the United States, she's not as popular, but I had the pleasure of meeting her and going to a workshop with her, and it was just amazing.
What an honor.
Yes, it was really great. And then I thought of a title for your next book. A sequel to death.
A sequel to death. Yes, that's a good one.
Could there be such a thing as a sequel to death?
That is a good question.
That's like an oxymoron, right?
Yes. And it raises questions of afterlife and things like that as well.
Right.
So it's very interesting.
Right.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Thayer. Do you mind
You're
if
welcome.
I
And the
that
death
away?
cafe. I've never heard of a death cafe either. And it's so true. We really don't talk about death and grief. I have a sister who lost a son at 2.5 years ago, and I know she's still grieving. And I know people say to her, well, you know, isn't it time to move on? But she said, Joanne, grief never ends. It just takes on a different persona, but it never actually ends.
Exactly.
I thought of that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for reading.
I loved your book. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Mrs. Thayer.
Can't wait for the next one. I'm glad I got unmuted, but you're probably not.
No, I'm glad you were able to speak to her directly. So that's always good.
Okay.
Maria,
go ahead.
It's not really a question, but a comment. Like, I got the foreshadowing that Leo was going to die. And oh my gosh, it was a gut punch. So tears, sobbing a couple times. And so I just wanted to say that it just really touched me. And I really...
Oh, thank you. Yes, I sometimes, even when I was writing it, I was like, oh, this is, even though I knew what was happening, obviously, because I was writing it. But actually, the audiobook narrator told me that when she was narrating that chapter, she had to stop because she was, but I think, like I said, he's my favorite character. And I think his death was definitely the hardest in the book. But with his character, and actually, well, all of the characters surrounding Clover, I really wanted to show, you know, that, as we all know, there's a loneliness epidemic, and there's a lot of lonely people out there who think they have nobody. But in fact, there's often a lot of people in the periphery who do really care about you and are kind of nudging you out of your shell, like Leo and Sylvie do for Clover. And I really wanted to pay tribute to people, especially the elder people in our lives, who really are there loving us in ways that aren't necessarily direct, but by this kind of tough love that he gives her. And I think perhaps that's the why people also like Leo the most, because he really, he has no obligation to her, but it is part of out of his friendship with her grandfather, he does feel this obligation to see her through life, since grandpa isn't there to do it. So yes, I really loved him too.
Thank you, Maria. Do we have anybody else?
Do I have to be on screen to ask a question?
You absolutely do not.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Speak, Judy. Yeah.
This is Judy, and I agree with what everyone has said about loving the book and how beautifully you handled it. My question is a little odd, but I was wondering how you decided to name your main character of Clover. What went into deciding upon her name?
Oh yeah, well, thank you for the question. Thanks for reading, Judy. That's a good question because there is a logic behind it. So as I mentioned, I was very close with my great aunts and uncles, and Clover was one of my great aunts, and she came from a family. So my grandmother, my mum's mum, died when my mum was 12 or 13, and so I never got to meet her, but she had, I think, like 7 or 8 sisters, and quite a few of them stepped in kind of as stand-in grandmothers. So I lost one but gained about 4. And Clover was one of them, who was so wonderful to me. She kind of had a bit of a Claudia element to her, was very, extroverted and well-traveled, and she really showed to me what it meant to live a very full, adventurous life. But what I learned when I was back in Tasmania for the book launch, and I'm related to a lot of Tasmania, so a lot of my family was at the launch, and Clover's son, my cousin, was there, and he said that I knew Clover was a nurse, but it turns out that she did work, she did some private work nursing people on their deathbed. So essentially, she was actually a death doula, and that name didn't exist back then. But what she was doing was exactly what Clover's doing. And so that was a nice synergy to find out after the book had been published.
Yes.
Nice.
Thanks, Judy, for the question. Do we have anybody else? Oh, hold on. Something popped up in chat. Okay. So the question in chat is, I had a question about Clover's parents and the choice to have their bodies never found. While Clover accepted their deaths, what if an alternative version of the story revealed that this was a lie her grandfather told her? That her parents were never coming home, not because they died, but because they chose to leave. How do you think she would have handled that realization? Would it have changed how she processed that grief?
Oh, that's
Okay.
a great question, Danica.
Oh.
Thank you. Yeah. I did actually think about not exactly that, but I did think about making the parents more of a thing. But then there were just so many threads that I think it would have been too much. So I had to just kind of streamline. But I think it definitely would have changed her grief, because if she knew that, then she would, I think a feeling of abandonment would have probably come. Like, her parents weren't great anyway, and they weren't very attentive. So I think, there's a certain wound from that. But I think knowing that they willingly just abandoned her would have definitely changed things. But yes, I think that would have made it would have shifted the focus of the story a little bit. One thing about the parents and also the teachers in those earlier scenes, I really loved Roald Dahl when I was a kid. I don't know if he was as popular in the United States.
Yes.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And what I really loved about his books is that generally, with a few exceptions, the adults were just terrible. The parents weren't great, or the teachers weren't great, like Miss Trunchbull and in Matilda and things like that. And so I kind of wanted to have those figures, the parents, be kind of Roald Dahl inspired, where, you know, the children are the wise ones in the story and kind of are where the magic lies.
Nice.
Wonderful, great questions. Thank you. That's that, right?
Yes,
All right.
one more message.
One more. Oh, one more.
Yep.
Oh yeah, sorry. So Julie says, I really liked how you developed Clover's relationship with her grandfather by introducing the relationship between grandfather and the bookseller. So true that often we think of our parents and grandparents only as they relate to us.
Yeah, I really like that you love that. Thank you, Judy, because I wanted to kind of make that point. You know, there was a time when I realized I was only seeing my mum as my mum. And as part of this whole process, I really tried to get to know her because to the whole point of my fear of death, I realized it wasn't a fear of my own death. It was a fear of losing my loved ones and not having said the things I wanted to say and savored their presence while I could. And so having that realization, I made an effort to really have these conversations with my mother, woman to woman, not as a mother to daughter, and ask her all the questions I've always wanted to know and things like that. And I think it is a disservice to people we love to only see them as our parent when they are whole human beings who have existed entirely separate from us for quite a long time. And I really wanted to illustrate that. And also it was just a little fun twist to put in at the end.
Nice.
Guys, you were asking great questions. I love that. Thank you so much. So before we close, it's 7:57. Last chance. If you have any other question, we can quickly ask, or if not, then
Very quickly, what was the second book? There was Shark Heart that you had enjoyed reading, but was it Marta, M-A-R-T-A?
Oh, Martyr, Martyr.
Thank you. Martyr. Thank you.
Yeah.
okay. Wonderful. All right. Okay. So Mikki, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And I hope you feel better, get better soon. And thank you for giving your time and just sharing your journey, your thoughts, your process, a bit of your life with us. And we had a wonderful time. So
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everybody for joining. I know it's a lot of effort to log on and join at night. So I really appreciate it. And thank you for reading my book. There's so many wonderful books out there. So the fact that you would read mine is such an honor.
So thank you very much and good luck with your future projects, and hopefully we'll be able to talk again when your new book
Yes, I'll let you know when it's all confirmed.
Yes, looking forward. Thank you so much, Mikki.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Good
Bye.
night.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
How do I get out?
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.